I'm going to be covering genetic engineering. Decided to take a leap of faith with this and go outside my comfort zone. So if you believe Wikipedia's definition of genetic disorders, it's an illness caused by one or more abnormalities in the genome, especially a condition that is present at birth. So it's congenital. So there's really two sort of branches of genetic disorders. So there's single gene disorders or multifactorial. So single genes can be something like autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, X-linked, Y-linked, and in some cases mitochondrial. And so some of them are like Huntington's, polycystic kidney disease, sickle cell anemia, and even though Huntington's has a 50% chance, if one of your parents has it, the actual prevalence is much lower. It's 1 in 1,500. And multifactorial disorders are things like asthma, cancer, diabetes, mood disorders, and schizophrenia. So just to refresh your memory on genetics and the history of it, it can be debated that it started out with Mendel when he was going through a garden and breeding flowers. So that was more or less the gene era, and then it continued into the DNA era, which in 1944, Avery, MacLeod, and McCarthy described genetic information is carried in DNA. In 1950, the discoveries of nucleotides, they're not perfectly in stable proportions. And in 1953, Watson and Cricket discovered the structure of DNA as we know it today as a double helix. And from the DNA era, we go into the genome era, which we are currently in. And so in 1990, that started the Human Genome Project. And in 2003, it wrapped up with its final publication of it and the complete sequencing of the last chromosome, which was the biggest, chromosome 1. So because of this, a lot of technology has come about, and some of it has been like in vitro fertilization for people who cannot have children. Other ones have been pre-implantation, which is stimulation of the mother to produce multiple eggs and pairing it with the father's sperm and looking for which eggs carry the desired traits. And now really exciting is the next generation sequencing, which has come from the genome era. And so it takes your DNA, it doesn't just look at one strand, looks at it from start to finish, but it looks at multiple in parallel, which allows it to be a lot faster. And so next generation sequencing technology has allowed us have higher demand for higher throughput output and lower costs. In 4 years that it's been around, it's gone from 1 gigabyte of data to 1 terabyte that it's able to analyze, and it allows for high flexibility. So you can say, I only want to look at this chromosome or this part of it. So if you want to look at Fragile X, the smallest part of the X chromosome. And so because of this, a lot of private companies have been established because people believe others should have access to their DNA and their sequencing. So companies can offer partial or full sequencing, and kind of depends on the company and price, and they usually do it by a mouse swab. They mail it to you, you send it back to the lab, and then they send you the data online. So depending on the company, this speed's pretty good. Cost isn't terrible, depending what you're willing to pay, and some of them actually have experts you can consult. Maybe not necessarily physician experts, but experts on the technology, on the company, etc., that can explain it to you really thoroughly. So these are some of the multiple companies that exist. So Biogenique is the one based in Quebec, and it's mostly, the website is in French, so kind of made it hard to read. Gene&U is the Canada one, and they do some pretty cool stuff. And Genetic Health is the one based in the UK, and they more so focus on sports health. And we looked at 23andMe in class. So just a reminder, it looks at your traits, ancestry, inherited conditions, and drug tolerance. And something like Counsel is a little bit more pricey than 23andMe, which is $199 in Canada. It's about $1,500, and that one actually looks at your family prep screen, informed pregnancy screen, and actually has experts on hand that you can contact. A really neat one is Pathway Genomics. And so they look at a larger spectrum of things. They look at cancer, cardiac, if you're a carrier for anything, pain management, weight management, and medication. And so in November, this came out. They actually paired up with IBM Watson to start working on more personalized consumer health. So basically, from my understanding, they're making this little app, and you could be like, should I drink coffee on Monday? Or what should I do in terms of exercising today? And based on your data or your DNA, it'll actually tell you and give you like custom feedback and say, this is how much coffee you should drink, or you've drank a lot and maybe you shouldn't be drinking as much coffee. So that's really neat and super exciting. So let's go a little bit into ethics. I'm just going to touch the surface of it because there's a lot of it. If you go into the U Alberta libraries, there's over 4,000 papers on ethics and genetics. So it's quite an extensive, broad topic. So the topics I'm going to go over a little bit are personal enhancement, embryo rights, privacy rights, and political issues. So for enhancements, a lot of people are concerned about this, and I think it's fair to be. Who gets the enhancements? Who doesn't? One paper I read actually suggested a lottery system as opposed to the rich can get enhancements and become more elite versus the poor fall behind. But the problem with the lottery system is if I win and you don't win, does that make me a winner and you a loser? And does that make a different kind of elite and then rich versus poor? So it's definitely something to consider. And how will the technology be distributed for enhancements among countries? And then go into the personal rights / embryo rights, which really stems from people's own points of view. Is an embryo really a person? And so the basic rights for someone are right to life, right to autonomy, right to aid, and a new one that can be debated is right not to know. So right to life should be fairly obvious. You have the right to live. Right to autonomy, once again, make your own choices, fairly obvious. Right to aid, the best example I can think of it is I am CPR trained and first aid trained. So if I see someone on the ground laying, there's no hazardous material around, I'm obligated to help them. And I should help them because they still have the right to live and have the right to help. So for an embryo, if you decide to take out a gene or manipulate their DNA so they don't have something like Down syndrome that would make their life harder, would have to have like a lot of specialized appointments and assisted care, would that be right to aid, that you'd be helping them making that decision? And then right not to know is if I go into a doctor's office and say, I want to know about my genes and my DNA, but I don't want to know about Huntington's. I know my mother doesn't have it, but for example, let's say maybe my father isn't in the picture and maybe he had it, but I would never know. The right not to know would be revoked if I did have it and I had siblings who might also have it. Because at that point, it's affecting my life and my family's life, and maybe it would affect my siblings on if they choose to have children or how they would handle it and make different life decisions. Technology is a big one. So how are we going to do the research on this? How are we going to get embryos to try and test and see if these changes and manipulations in DNA work? Obviously, it's going to be a very slow process because we'd have to monitor it. It's not something like artificial intelligence or prosthetics, which is a lot more rapid than biological systems in DNA. So who will be willing to sign off and be like, you have this many embryos to use and test for this? Or who will be willing to give it up? And then privacy. Who has the rights to the data? Is the company allowed to have it and to continue analyzing it for you as they continue to have more tests come up? And how will the information be shared across different domains? If your family physician is in rural Alberta, but they don't have the technology or the computer systems to access it, and you can only go into a city 3 hours away, how's that going to be possible? And political. So in the US, they implemented the Generic Information Non-Discrimination Act. So that basically says that if you get tested and you know you have something, you won't be discriminated against for health insurance and employers. However, this doesn't apply for long-term care and life insurance. So if you have Alzheimer's, are they going to charge you more because they know you might be senile, you might be more difficult to deal with? And this is only for the US, so I'm not quite sure if Canada has something like this or not. And for enhancement, parents aren't always going to get it right. So this is a little cartoon that says, look here, young lady, it costs us a fortune to give you a set of musical genes to get on and play that bloody thing. Parents aren't always going to make the right choice for their children. Maybe you don't like the school you went to in the elementary. I think certain things will be enhanced more so than others, one of them being intelligence and strength. While musically inclined may not be the top one, parents who are more musically inclined musicians may want their children to have the same genes. So they would more so encourage them, just kind of like how you encourage a kid to play a sport or an instrument. So where are we heading now? As you can see, when it first started out, the cost per raw megabase of DNA sequence was significantly higher than what it's decreased to now. And it's clearly not following Moore's law of decreasing double of it every year. And same with the cost per genome. For $100 million when it started in 2001 to now, where it's a full genome. And if you only want it partially, you can go to 23andMe and pay $199, and you can get probability for things. So it's significantly decreasing, and it will continue to decrease in the next few years. And there's more money going to be put into it. According to Aligned Market Research, bioinformatics, which includes genetics, will have about $12 billion put in by 2020 for research and other things. So it's really exciting to be in genetics right now, even though it's going to take longer time. So what do people think about genetics right now? So there was a survey done in the paper, and they looked at how patients felt. And a lot of them felt like they were familiar with genetic testing, but they didn't really feel knowledgeable. So they just felt familiar, like they know it exists, they kind of know what it does, but not too terribly knowledgeable. Some other stats. 4% actually expect to get tested in the next 5 years, and 80% expect that testing will become more prominent in the next 5 years. But physicians feel a little bit differently. They feel like 75% of their patients should have one and would benefit from it. And about 50 to 60% feel like they could diagnose disorders better and would catch things that could be preventable if they knew about it and their patients had this genetic test. However, the concerning part is 50% of them do not feel comfortable with the testing yet. They aren't terribly familiar and don't feel like they have adequate training. And 40% are concerned with the effectiveness of the technology, and I don't blame them. I think there's a lot to be improved on, but at the rate it's going, it's quite exciting. So we've looked at a little bit the molecular level, a little bit of ethics, and a little bit of how people feel and where it's heading into the future, and some of the concerns of patients and physicians. So how do we get from a baby to a superhuman? Obviously, we can't really just put genes into people as when they're adults. It would have to be when they're younger, like an embryo. So it would have to be selection of genes and looking at a fertilized egg and seeing like which genes are selective and go from there. So what do I think is going to happen? I think in the future, preventable or like common diseases and disorders will be preventable. Like trisomy 21, Down syndrome. Most parents want their child to be happy and healthy, and considering how much they really need for it in terms of like extra therapy, extra assistance, everything, I think those are the first to go. And then I think we're going to start looking at more multifactorial disorders, like schizophrenia. Things we don't quite understand right now, but as we look at more genes and DNA, we'll start getting a better idea of how genes and proteins play with each other. And then finally, it's going to go into personal enhancements. Probably intelligence and strength is going to be first. Other things like speed, musically inclined, athletics will be next. Distribution, I think it's going to be like a personal computer, maybe a car or like a phone, where it's going to be really expensive at the beginning, and it showed to be very expensive at the beginning, and then it's going to become cheaper and cheaper for everyone to get. A MacBook cost several $1,000s when it first came out, and now you can buy a pretty good one for $2,000. Or a tablet, you can buy one for like $100, and a couple of years ago it was like close to 1,000. Ethics, I think, is going to be a long, drawn-out debate, and it's going to be really hard to convince some people. Some people will never want to enhance their child or do it. Just let God do his work. Technology will be modified and created to be better, because currently I think in Alberta, 1 in 20 people who get screened for something like trisomy 21, trisomy 18, or 13 get a false positive. That's huge. 5% rate of false positive when you're making a decision if you want to carry the pregnancy to term or abort is not something you really want to play with. So accuracy is going to be definitely something we're screening for more. And I think it's going to go into a cycle. We're going to choose a disorder and see this is the one we want to fix next. And then we're going to do some research. Technology is going to be developed. Ethics are going to come into play throughout it. But realistically, it's always going to be there in some large capacity, not just after the technology was created. And then we're going to apply it and distribute it and then continue on to that cycle. So what will the future look like? Will disadvantageous genes be eliminated from the large majority? Absolutely, I think so. Most parents want their child to be happy and healthy. And for some, that's all they want. They don't want their child to suffer. They don't want them to have a hard life. Will people add more advantageous genes to their child? Yes. If I could probably make my child smarter right off the bat, I would do it. Would I maybe make them have more musically inclined? Probably not, mostly because I'm not super musically inclined. I think it's going to be something more personal for choice. Will it initially be expensive? Yes. Will it save costs elsewhere? I think so. And I wanted to show you this. So this is Tyler's troubled case or career. And so Tyler was a child that was born to a teenage mother. And so he had a hard life. He went through foster care, had been taken away from his home from his alcoholic father, developed some personality disorders, got diagnosed with a couple mental health disorders and issues, and then started going in and out of juvenile care, juvenile youth system for court and going to a psychiatrist and getting medication and going to the hospital, etc. So how much did Tyler cost? In 30 years and 10 of those years spent in jail, $1.5 million. And that's in Canada. So I think if we invest in other things now, it won't be as bad in the system. It's gonna cost, but the cost might just be reallocated. And questions?
Do you think at any point that, say, sequencing will be mandatory for people?
I wouldn't say mandatory. I think people will want to know about how their life is going to be affected by certain genes. I certainly do. While with an older population, they might not, because what can they do about it? But with more people being able to have the option to do something about it, they'll want to know and fix it right away.
So do you see this impacting us in the next 5 years kind of thing, or do you see the major impact being significantly later than that? Or
I think we're starting to see the impact already. There was recently a news article about an Australian couple coming to the US and being like, I want a girl. I'm not leaving without being pregnant with a girl officially. So I think we're always starting to see that with gender. With other things, I think it's going to take time because testing and research will be really hard, but people are always trying to look at getting sequenced or tested and seeing what it is. Not necessarily their full genome, but for high probability things an older population might be interested. If come the age of 45, they're like, should I be seeing if I'm getting Alzheimer's? Should I be prepared?
Yes. So the David Pearce idea of changing the hedonic threshold, do you think a lot of people are naturally interested in that? Do you think it comes up in this course only because he's talking about it, or is it something all of you have sort of always wished for, not to feel pain, or where do you feel where do your thoughts lie about where the priority of that would fit in with the priority of all the other things? I noticed that you didn't mention that. You didn't mention pain threshold.
I don't know, I kind of brought this up with a bunch of my friends and was like, if you could have one of the three, which one would it be? So I asked, would you not do anything to your child? Would you just ensure your child doesn't have like Down syndrome or anything like that,
right.
Something that's like a single gene, or would you enhance it? And a lot of the responses I got from like people I know and talk to was a single gene. They would eliminate just to ensure like their child doesn't grow up struggling or like have problems like being bullied, being stigmatized against, having to go to like an occupational therapist, a speech therapist, a physical therapist throughout their life and just struggle. So they draw the line at like being happy and healthy.
Yes, I think that if you think of the enhancements of your home or your living room as opposed to enhancing your child, it seems to me they're different and non-overlapping categories, right? That with your child, you'd want to be thinking of the child's welfare and things like that, and not just what's cool and what's the latest fad. But do you think that one of the unfortunate things that might occur in the future is those two would overlap? Like the kind of thinking that you put behind what you would like your living room or house to look like. Do you think that will extend to our children? I mean, that's sort of the dark side of this, right? That we would do, enhancements that are just because it's something that through some whim that we want this, that it's not necessarily better for society or for the child.
Yeah, I certainly think some parents might take it overboard and want to like load up their child with every enhancement possible available at the market at the time.
Right.
But I don't know, I would personally rather have like a child, ensure my child isn't born with like out a limb or like a shorter limb or something, than maybe do a prosthetic. While that option is great for later in life when accidents do happen, and because they do,
right.
But starting off at a good place I think is really important, because I don't personally just want to put in like a really good prosthetic eye in like my child.